So the table shows the tax rate, standard deductions, and exemptions for the 4 filing status categories. This is from 2012. So, it's different for single, if a person is single, married filing separately, married filing jointly, and the head of household. So unmarried and paying more than half of the cost of supporting a child or parent. For each case for unmarried or married filing separately, the standard deduction is $59.50. Again, we will have to decide if the itemized deduction is more or less than that amount, which it's different for married or unmarried as head of household. And you can see that the personal exemptions per person, right, is $3,800, right, per person. And so this is from 2012. I know that those numbers are a little bit larger now. But anyway, so we're going to use this chart. So suppose that we are single and we make $10,000. You're only taxed 10% of the initial of the $8,700. Anything more than $8,700, like if you earned $10,000, that would be an extra $1,300 from this $8,700. You would pay 15% on that $1,300. Right? So it doesn't mean like if you earn between this amount, you're going to pay 33% in taxes. You only pay 33% in taxes of the amount above the previous amount listed in the chart. So we'll see how that works. Find the total income tax for a married person filing separately, assuming that the person has a taxable income of $28,000. Okay, so it doesn't say anything about children, so we'll just assume that there's actually it doesn't even mention anything about exemptions here, so we don't need to worry about that. Okay, so we have so we're going to look in our chart, married person filing separately, which is the second column. Unfortunately, I can't go back to that slide. But this second column was marrieds filing separately. And then, so it's 10% and 15%. So in that second column, it's up to $8,700. Again, you can just look at the chart in your notes. 15% for $8,701 to $35,350. Okay, so they earned income tax of $28,000, which actually falls in this range right here, so we don't need to write any more of the chart. But just remember that you only pay 10% up to $8,700, and we know how we find a percent of a number. We just change these to a decimal and multiply by the amount. Now we're going to pay 15% on the amount that falls more than $8,700. Well, we have a total taxable income of $28,000, right? But we pay 10% on the first $8,700. So we're going to pay 15% on any amount over that, right? So $28,000 minus $8,700 is $19,300. So we're going to pay 15% on the $19,300, right? These should total, those things just in the parentheses, right? Those should total $28,000. Right? That's what we're getting taxed on, but it's different amounts, right? This is 15% of amount over $8,700. Okay, so let's add those together. 10% of $8,700 should be $870. And 15%, 0.15 times 19,300, that should give you $2,895. So the total federal income tax is $87.65. Again, this is federal, not state. So this is assuming we already know the taxable income, right? We would go through those, the first example, right? Parts A, B, and C that we did, we were able to calculate the taxable income. Then we use it along with that chart, and there's a similar one for 2016, that chart to figure out the federal income taxes. All right, we're going to do one more of these. Let's calculate the income tax owed by a single woman with no dependents whose gross income adjustments, deductions, and credits are given. Use the marginal tax rates from the table. So with no dependents, a single woman with no dependents, her gross income is $62,000. She has $4,000 in adjustments. We'll subtract that off to get the adjusted gross income. She has a tax credit of $500. So her deductions are listed. Mortgage interest, property taxes, charitable contributions. Again, we would add those up and see if they are more than the standard deduction. Right, which I'm guessing that we add those up, it will be more than the standard deduction, but we will check whether we use this itemized deduction or the standard deduction. And $1,500, which this is also a deduction, $1,500 medical expenses not covered by insurance. What we, again, remember that for medical expenses, it has to be more than 7.5 of the adjusted gross income. So the adjusted gross income, I think that's question 1 in the next slide. It says the adjusted gross income. You can write it down on the next slide if you want. The adjusted gross income is, of course, the income minus the gross income minus the adjustments. So in this case, the gross income is $62,000 minus the adjustments of $4,000. So that would give $58,000. So when we want to know whether this is part of the itemized deduction, this medical expenses, we need to know whether we have to calculate 7.5% of the adjusted gross income and decide if it's more. So let's go ahead and do that. Here is the adjusted gross income. So let's go ahead here and do, we want to figure out what is 7.5% of 5,800. So that's 0.075. Of course, means times 5,800. Or no, 58,000, sorry, not 5,800. So 0.075 times 58,000 is 0.075 times 58,000 is 4,350, right? But this 1,500 is not more than this. Okay, so if that deduction, if that amount, that medical expenses is more than 7.5% of the adjusted gross income, we can use it in our itemized deduction. However, that $1,500 is not more than 7.5% of the adjusted gross income, so we are not going to include it in our itemized deduction. Okay. So you are just going to have to refer back to the slide in your notes. We did this already. We had a gross income of $62,000 and subtracted off $4,000 in deductions. I have $58,000 is adjusted gross income. And then we want the taxable income, which is $58,000 minus the exemptions and deductions. So this was a single woman with no dependents. So the exemption is $3,800. That's fixed from the chart. If she had 2 dependents, you would subtract off 2 more $3,800s. Fixed from chart. And we want to subtract off the deductions and the standard deduction. We want to compare standard or itemized, right? We need to see which one's more. The standard deduction from the chart on the previous page, if you look at the first column, which is single with no dependents, is the standard deduction is $5,950. This is from the chart. The second row from the bottom. And the itemized deduction, we need to add those together and determine if it's more than $5,950. Well, even the mortgage interest, if you look at the last slide on the deductions, the mortgage interest was $7,500. Property taxes were $2,200. And charitable contributions were $2,400. We couldn't include the $1,500 for the medical expenses because they were not high enough. $7,500 plus $2,200 plus $2,400, and that is $12,100. So we definitely want to subtract off the itemized deduction, right? You want to subtract off the most because you want the least to pay the least number of taxes on your income, right? So $12,100. We definitely want to use this opposed to the standard deduction. So $58,000 minus $3,800 minus $12,100 is $42,100. Okay, that is the taxable income. And next we'll compute the income tax. Income tax is the tax computation minus tax credits. So remember, we're going to go back to that chart that gives us the tax rates. So our, let's remind ourselves, so the taxable income from the last slide was $42,100. Okay, and then we're going to go back and look at the chart. We first compute the income tax and then we subtract off the tax credits at the end. Okay, so if we look, she was single and $42,100. So if we look at the very first column was single, and then go back to your chart. Again, you can pause it and try to figure this out on your own if you like. And see if you get the same thing. Single up to $8,700. This was $8,701 to $35,350. Well, the taxable income's $42,100, so we need to go one more. $35,351 to $71,350. Again, this is that chart. And her income does fall in this range right here. All right, so we don't need to write out any more of the chart there. So, and it tells you exactly what to do. We want 10% of the first 8,700. And then 15% of the taxable income between 8,701 and 35,350. So what we need to do is figure out what that difference is. Get out the calculator. 35,350 minus 26,650. Okay, so the second amount, right, is only for income between 8,701 and 35,350 minus the 8,700, and that is 26,650 is how much is in this range. So she's taxed 15% on the 26,650, right? Only the amount between those two, right? And then 25% on the amount that falls in this interval, and her total taxable income is 42,100. So we take 42,100 minus 35,350, right? 42,100 minus 35,350. So that is 6750. So she pays 25% on the 6750. And again, all of these total amounts, when you add them up, should add up to her income, her total income, right? Because she pays 10% on part of it, 15% on part of it, and 25% on part of it. So you should check by adding those three numbers to see if you get this, right? So let's add those together. 10% of 8,700 plus 15% of course, which means times 26,650. So her income taxes are $6,555. All right, and then we want that's her tax computation. And then we just need to subtract any tax credits, right? And she has a, let's look back, the tax credit was 500. So the total income tax that she will need to pay is 6,555 minus 500, which was the tax credit. Right up here it says income tax is tax computation minus tax credit. So that looks like $6,055 is what she is going to have to pay for income tax.